So I love stories about how people met. And my wife can tell you, I'm probably slightly obnoxious about it. Anytime I meet a new couple, I'm like, okay, how'd you meet? I gotta know, tell me everything. And I'll have like 1,000 follow-up questions. And I'm like, hold on, slow it down. I need to visualize this better. Or anytime we go out to eat with a couple, maybe if I've known them for years, I'm like, how'd you guys meet again? I need the story. I need the full story. Like, run it down for me. And they're like, well, it's gonna take 3 hours. And I'm like, I got time, okay? I'm into this. I love stories about people's relationship, how they became friends, what happened. Because the events in our lives shape us and mold us into who we are. And that's true of our relationships too. And so I've heard a lot of relationship stories over the years. Like some people you talk to, they go way back. And they're like, well, we grew up together in a small town. We went to the same school. We went to the same high school, went to the same junior high school, went to the same church. My family was close with their family. We had all the same friends. We went to all the same events. And I'm like, you guys related? Like, are you sure you're not related? You had Alabama plates too, so I'm just checking to make sure. Like, it's all, just check that, okay? And so, like, it's sweet, but you're like, that's a little. But some people have a long story like that. They go way back. Then other people I talk to, you know, they dated in high school. And so they're high school sweethearts, and that's always cute too. You know, like we started dating our freshman year, and we just never stopped. That's beautiful. I love that story. I hear this story a lot. This one's beautiful, but kind of bums me out on the front end because a lot of times this usually happens with a girl towards a guy. Ladies, maybe you feel me on this one. But a girl will be like, oh, him? Oh, when I first met him, blah. I was like, yikes. And like he had like hairy knuckles and a hairy back, and he had like a Cro-Magnon man, like unibrow. And I was like, this guy is hideous. He's gross. I'd never date him. And like, oh, is he boyfriend material or bridge troll material? I don't even know. And then usually after this verbal assault, she'll be like, but then one day, something clicked. And then I just fell in love with him, what. And I'm like, man, I just watched this dude get beat down verbally for 10 minutes. All his self-esteem's gone. And then she finally like, but then I finally loved with him. And so like, those are interesting stories too. Or sometimes I'll meet people and their origin story for their relationship is much like mine. And they, fall in love at first sight. You know what I'm saying? They have that like love at first sight moment, just like I did. And so I love people's relationship stories. And what we're doing in this series, in this Before Philippians series, is we are looking at the relationship, kind of the origin story of the relationship between Paul and the Philippians. And that's to prepare us for when we study Philippians here in 2 weeks. We're going to get into 4 weeks in the book of Philippians. And so this series is setting us up for that. We're going to see what's the relationship between Paul, the Philippians, and how does that affect the reading. Because we talked about this last week, just as a quick recap, review. When we read Philippians, when we're going to read it here in 2 weeks, we are reading someone else's mail. But God in his providence, and because the inspiration of Scripture, it's relevant to our lives today. God intended for us to have it. It went through this miraculous process to be in our hands today. And it's not written to us, but it's written for us. But as we're reading someone else's mail, we need to be aware who is writing it, to whom, and really to read Philippians well, to understand it well, and to apply it to our lives well. We need to understand the characters it involves. We need to understand their culture. We need to understand the context in which it was written, and we need to understand their relationship. So, by analogy, if 2,000 years from now, someone excavates your phone, okay? They dig it up, they unearth it, and they're like, what is this? And they're trying to learn about the time period in which we live. Say they're going through your phone and they see something like one of these pictures here. Let's throw it up. There's a picture of a phone. Ethan, anything? Okay, there we go. All right, so what if they see this? Notice the number at the top. I was trying to call Hollywood. 555-555-555-555. What if they see this? There's an excited guy, there's a dancing baby, and like, I don't know, like, what was this culture? What were they trying to communicate? Did they use only pictures and hieroglyphics? What was this? Or like, go to the next picture. Like, who was that angry man? Who was the disgruntled child? Who is this dancing guy? What does this mean? And they would probably see in your text, they would see different cultural references and pop cultural references and political references. And they would see words like lit and fi, and to be honest with you, I don't know what those things mean. So 2,000 years from now, they'd have no chance. But they'd see a lot of stuff and they'd be like, I don't even know what this means. Or maybe they don't know the nature of your relationship with the friend that you're messaging, and so they can't pick up on sarcasm. So your friend could say like, hey dude, thinking about dyeing my hair bright green and shaving the sides. And then you could put as a response in all caps, yeah, that's a great idea. But you're being sarcastic, like, yeah, that's a great idea. But they might read it and be like, oh, he thought it was a great idea. Maybe everyone's hair was green. Maybe that was the culture back then. Because they don't know that you're being sarcastic. I had a friend in college from Switzerland, we called him Swiss Chris, and he didn't understand sarcasm. He said in his culture they didn't have sarcasm. So he's like, I don't understand that. And I'm like, wow, you guys sound like a lot of fun. He's like, thank you, we are a lot of fun. I'm like, no, that was sarcasm, Chris. That was sarcasm. But he wasn't getting it. So if someone happened upon your texts, your letters, whatever, 2,000 years from now, they'd have a hard time putting it together. So it is with Philippians. It's tough to put together, tough to understand. So we're going to look at the relationship, the context, the culture, all that stuff in this series to help you better understand it. Now, we launched into next week a story. And I told you guys one of the best things to do when you're reading one of Paul's letters to a specific church at a specific time in a specific place, go to the book of Acts. So if you're like in Corinthians, you're going to be like, oh no, I don't know anything about the Corinthians. Where's Corinth? I don't know anything about this. So then, apparently you're a 72-year-old man saying this. I don't know why I did that voice. I don't know. And you should always go back to the book of Acts, and then you can look and find, oh, okay, here's what it looks like when Paul went to Corinth. Okay, cool, this helps me understand better. That's what we're doing in this series. And last week we were in Acts 16, and in Acts 16, Paul was traveling to Philippi. And we talked about how Paul came out of this place called Jerusalem, and he was just ready to go. He's ready to go share the gospel with everyone. He's like, ooh, gotta tell everyone about Jesus. Gotta tell everyone about Jesus. And he starts to go to these different places. 2 times he gets shot down from going where he wants to go because God told him to pump the brakes. 2 times God was like, well, nope, not yet. And so then he finds himself in this waiting period in this place called Troas, and he doesn't know what to do. And then God appears to Paul, or God makes known to Paul what he's supposed to do next. And Paul has a vision. And in this vision, Paul sees this guy in this place called Macedonia, which is where the city of Philippi is. And Paul sees this man, and this man's crying out to him, Paul, come to Macedonia. We need your help. And so, and this sounds desperate. And so we talked last week, well, you might be thinking, like, what kind of a vision did Paul have? Like, what was Paul smoking? Like, was he tripping out? Like, what's going on? No, God speaks through visions. He still does today. I know even for myself, if I'm praying about something, sometimes God just, like, inceptions an idea or a picture into my head that I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. And so that's kind of what God did with Paul. He kind of gave him this vision of someone who needed him. It was this, like, profound thing. So Paul immediately, once he sees this vision, he feels led by the Holy Spirit. He immediately sets off for Philippi. And we have actually the verse up there from Acts 16 last week. When Paul had seen the vision, immediately he wasted no time. He sought to go into Macedonia, where Philippi is, concluding that God had called him to preach the gospel to them. He felt called by God to go preach the gospel, to tell the good news of Jesus, Jesus' kingdom, Jesus' rule and reign on the earth, and what Jesus had done for the Philippians, the forgiveness and grace offered to them. So he goes to Philippi. Now, I want to show you a map. I'm a visual learner. If people just talk to me too much, I'm like, I check out. I have a hard time paying attention. Well, squirrel. So let's throw the map up here. This is what the world looked like to Paul. It was a cartoon rendering. And he went from, so last week, see up there by Galatia, he goes to Troas, and that's where he was just hanging out last week. He's like, I don't know what to do. What do I do? What do I do? And then he finally goes up to Philippi there. So that's where it is on the map. And that piece hanging out, you see Italy over there, and then this is Greece and Macedonia. The top part is Macedonia. That's where Philippi is. So Paul goes to Philippi. Now, next week, we're going to get into a lot of culture about Philippi because it'll be really important for the sermon next week. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to tell you kind of one thing about Philippi this week. And let's go to that verse. Setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage, we being Paul and his crew, which I'll introduce to you in a second, made a direct voyage to Samothrake, which sounds sexy, I like that, Samothrake. And then the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is where the Philippians are from, in Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. Everyone say Roman colony. Very good. All right, so Roman colony, and we remained in the city some days. So here's what you need to know about this place, Philippi. Philippi was a very important city. It was a very Roman city. Can we go back to the map, actually? So Philippi was kind of a gateway to go to Asia. So like Philippi, a lot of people would go from Philippi, cross the sea there, and they would move into Asia. And the Roman Empire was mostly on this side of the world in Europe. And then there was Asia over here, which was less developed. And so if people were wanting to go from Rome to Asia, a lot of times they would go by way of Philippi. So it was kind of a gateway city. By analogy, I moved here from Missouri. Don't hate, don't judge. I moved here from Missouri, and there's this place called St. Louis, and it's like the gateway to the west. And it's kind of a place you would go before you head west. And between St. Louis and the next major city, there's like not a lot there. It's kind of how Philippi was. It was a port city. A lot of people went there. And because it was a port city, there was lots of trade, lots of commerce. It had a thriving economy. And so Philippi was rich. Like Philippi had a lot of wealth, okay? So it's a Roman colony. You need to know it's a port city. It's a passageway to Asia. They're very wealthy, very affluent, okay? This is like your East Cobb, okay? This is like what Philippi is, okay? Maybe that's a good reference for it. The other thing you need to know is it's very Roman. A huge percent of the population is Roman. Now you hear that and you just might be like, oh my gosh, what am I in history class? Who cares? It's going to be really relevant to our story today and all the more relevant to our story next week. And so it's very Roman. It's immersed in Roman culture. Rome had its own way of doing things. It had its own ways of viewing the world, of interpreting the world, of treating people. There was different classes in society. So this is very Roman and held to Roman culture. That's all I really need you to know about it. And so we track Paul's journey from Jerusalem. Boom, God brings him to Philippi, and God is writing an amazing story for Paul. He's going to forge some friendships with Paul. Paul's going to actually interact with 3 people, and the Lord is going to build a church in Philippi. And that brings us to our story today. As Paul has landed, he's freshly landed right off the boat to Philippi, he's going to encounter some people. Now, as we get into the story today, I got to introduce you to Paul's crew. I referenced them last week. I didn't want to take the time to necessarily explain all of them, so I'm going to introduce them to you this week. So first of all, Paul's crew involves Paul. So Paul, why don't you come out? And everyone's got a T-shirt, so you can tell who they are. Let's give it up for him. Let's give it up. There's Paul. Hey, runway walk, pageant wave, pageant wave, pageant wave. Paul, he has his shirt tucked in. He's trying to be fancy. All right, so then Paul brought his boy with him, his mentor, the person who he's been training in the faith. The Bible says he's a father to him in the faith, Timothy. So Timothy, why don't you come out? That's like his best friend. It's the guy he's mentoring. They're tight. Timothy does amazing things in the church. Timothy's an amazing pastor. He pastors in Philippi for a while. So we got Paul, we got Timothy. Then they bring Paul's boy with them, Silas. So Silas, you come on out. Silas, come on out. Pageant wave to the people as you come out. Pageant wave to the people as you come out. Hey, everybody. All right, so that's Silas. They bring Silas with them. And then lastly, they bring this guy here. Fellas, scoot over here a little bit. They bring this guy named Luke. Here, fellas, make your way this way. There's this guy named Luke who comes out. Now, Luke, his name should stand out to us. Wave at the people, Luke. Wave at the people. Wave at the people. Show them some love. Hey. Okay, so Luke actually was one of the disciples of Jesus. Oh. And Luke actually wrote a book of the Bible, and Luke named it Luke, which he's either super narcissistic or has zero creativity. I don't know, one of the two. But he names the book after himself. And it's an account of the life of Jesus. And then Luke actually went on to write the book of Acts, which is actually where we are today. He writes about the growth of the early church. And he knows about the spread of the early church because he was there. He was there. He saw the whole thing. And Luke is a doctor. He's a scientist. He's an historian. He's a scholar. He's a Renaissance man. Kind of like you, Cameron, actually. And he writes everything down. And he's not going to pull punches. And he's not going to make stuff up because he's a super intellectual person. So everything we can read in Acts, we can trust because that's how Luke rolls. So, fellas, let's scoot over here a little bit. Follow me, follow me. So they get into Philippi, right? Now, let's go to our next verse, 13. Let's see what they do. Let's see what they do. Let's see what they do. It says, on the Sabbath day, notice we, because Luke is writing. Luke, put your hand up. Wave at everyone. We, his crew, went outside the gate to the riverside. Now, let me stop with the Sabbath day. Some of you might know what the Sabbath day is. Some of you might not know. So I'm going to explain it real quick. The Sabbath day is the day of the week where Jewish people choose to worship. We as Christians worship on Sunday. Jewish people worship on Sabbath, which is sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. Okay, so this is probably a Saturday more than likely. And they were looking for a place to worship because Paul and all of his compadres, all of his boys, they are Jewish. And so they would normally go worship on the Sabbath. So they get there and they're ready to go worship, get their praise on the Sabbath. And they're looking for a place called a synagogue, which is where Jewish people go to worship. They're looking for that. By analogy, my wife and I went to Europe last October. And we were in the Netherlands and we got there on a Sunday. And so I was furiously looking at my phone. I'm like, where is a church? Because it's Sunday and I want to go to church. And we found this Hillsong church in Amsterdam. And we're like, cool, we're going to go there. It was Sunday. We're Christians. We want to get our praise on. So we went to church. That's kind of what Paul and his boys are going to do. They're like, hey, it's Sabbath or Shabbat, as they would say. Let's go to a synagogue and worship. What's more, this was part of Paul's strategy in ministry. Paul was a Jewish guy, and so what he would do as he traveled the world is he would first go to a synagogue and he would preach to Jewish people. He would tell them about Jesus. And what's great about this is they knew the Old Testament, so Paul would always, if you look at his preaching, always point back to the Old Testament, talk about all God's promises, and be like, hey, Jesus fulfilled all of those promises. God did something brand new by taking sin on himself in Jesus. So now debts are paid, you are forgiven, and you are called to follow after Jesus. And so Paul always did this. He always went to synagogues first. It says it in Romans. Paul says, I go first to the Jews, then to the non-Jews. And think about it too. This is easy for Paul. I mean, he's able to communicate with his own people, and he's got a burden for his own people. Now, honestly, this is maybe 60, 40, 80, 20. Usually doesn't work well for Paul. In fact, he gets beat up a couple times in doing this. But that was always his strategy. So Paul, Jewish guy, on the Sabbath, his approach is to find the synagogue first. But here's the problem. In Philippi, it's a very Roman place. So they're like, where's the synagogue at? Where's the synagogue? There's not a Roman, because it's, Philippi, because it's so Roman, it's not a very diverse place. There's not a lot of Jewish people there. So these guys are definitely a minority there, and they can't find a synagogue to worship. So here's what they do. Problem solving. They go, let's go outside the gate to the riverside. Let's do that. Come on. And so they go outside the city. Now, what they're going to look for is one of two things. This is more like the teachy stuff, the facts and the details that you need so we can get to the application at the end. Two things they're going to look for. Maybe there's a synagogue outside the city. There's a place we can worship outside of the city. This place is really Roman, and we're probably some of the only Jewish people here. So a lot of times in those cases, in those situations, they would go outside the city and there'd be a smaller synagogue where Jewish people could kind of find refuge and be like, hey, we're a minority, we have to move outside the city. So they were either looking for that, or if Jewish people were traveling and they didn't have a synagogue to worship, they would look in the city for other Jewish people, and they would look for what's called a minyan. Now, not a minion like an evil hench person that will do stuff for you, like a minion like that. No, it's a minion. It's more think of a small group. And so in early first century Judaism, they had this rule that 10 Jewish men could get together and huddle up, and they would form a small group if they had no synagogue to worship in. And in this group of 10, the circle of 10 men, we'll talk about that in a second, circle of 10 men, they would study the Old Testament, they would sing, and they would pray together. So by analogy, say Brooke and I are actually going to Europe again in October. Yes. And say we're traveling in Prague, and it's a Sunday, and I'm like, oh man, there's no Hillsong church here. There's no church here. And we go to a coffee shop, and we see a bunch of Christians in the corner with some Bibles. Then we could be like, oh, dope, that's a Bible study. Okay, and we could be like, hey, can we sit in with you guys? Hey, we're creepy weirdos just happening upon you. And so we could join their small group. It's kind of what Paul and his boys are looking to do. They're trying to find either a synagogue or this thing called a minyan, this circle of 10 Jewish men that are having a Bible study. Now again, as a side note, this is the cultural stuff that we don't know upon first glance in reading it, that we want to teach you so you can more easily read and understand the story. So they go outside the city. Here's the problem. There's no synagogue to be found. And so then it says they came to this place of prayer, and they sat down, and they spoke to the women who had come together. So as the boys are looking, they come to this place, and there's no synagogue. We can't find a minyan, a circle of men. And so then, girls, come on out. They find this group of women. Come on out, come on out. Give it up for the girls, guys. Give it up for the girls. I should have them play Girls Want to Have Fun. Some girls. All right. So they find this group of women, and they're huddled up. And so they're going to talk to these women. Now, here's the thing. Here's what I would suggest. This group of women was probably a minyan, a small group of 10 people huddled together, having a worship service. And they were probably Jewish because, again, this is the Sabbath. And they are in this small group. And there's going to be a couple other things we see that will kind of tip us off to what this group is doing. And so, next we are introduced to the main character. Next verse. It says, one who heard us, again us, because Luke is writing. Luke, put your hand up, Luke. Wave at the people. Wave him, Cameron, that's you, you're Luke. Okay, Luke says, know thyself. Heard us, and a woman named Lydia from this city in and around Macedonia, a seller of purple goods who was a worshiper of God. Now, we're introduced to Lydia. So Lydia, wave at the people. She's the leader of this group, of this minyan. Now, here's a couple things you need to know about Lydia. Why? It's so weird that it goes out of its way to say where she's from and it says she's a seller of purple goods. Why does that even matter? Just a little cultural thing. This is just like kind of interesting. That place where Lydia is from, shows the accuracy of the Bible. Historians have said that in this place, there's these little like oyster-like things, these little like clam-like things called mollusks that you can actually pick from the water, and if you crack them open and squeeze them, they have this like purple dye that they emit. And so what Lydia would do is she was from this place where she could harvest all these little like shells, if you will, and she could get this purple dye and she could make purple clothing. Now to us, we're just like, why does that matter at all? Well, here's the deal. In this culture, in this society, you had to have stacks on stacks to be able to afford purple clothes. That was only for the wealthy. So essentially, Lydia is selling a high-end product to a high-end clientele base. So when you sell something very expensive to someone with a lot of money, you're going to make a lot of money. By analogy, if Lydia was from Texas and she goes out in her backyard and she finds oil, she could sell that oil to like ExxonMobil or something like that, and she's gonna make a ton of money. Selling a high-end product to a high-end clientele, you're gonna make a lot of money. So Lydia is wealthy, well-resourced, and it goes out of its way to say she was a worshiper of God. So the evidence is stacking up here that this is in fact this small group, this minion. They're meeting on the Sabbath outside of the city, in a small group, just like you were supposed to do, and it says that she's a worshiper of God. In the original language, it says she's one who fears God. So she's probably Jewish, like Paul and his compadres, like Paul and his crew. This is going to factor in. So the next verse. The Lord opened her heart, Lydia's heart, to pay attention to what was said by Paul. And after, she was baptized. Whoa! Okay, so this is kind of the end of the story today. This is weird. That happened all really fast. Let's slow this down. First of all, the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. We're not given any dialogue. We're not told what Paul said. We don't really know. So here's the deal. You have to know about Paul and how Paul rolled. Again, Paul last week was super ambitious, super excited to go share Jesus with everyone. I want to tell everyone about Jesus. I want to tell everyone about Jesus. He was stoked about it. That's exactly what Paul was going to preach. He was going to preach about Jesus. And so he's going to talk to Lydia. Come on, Paul, come over here. He's going to talk to Lydia. Lydia, step forward. And so that was how they greeted each other back then. You're right. What's up, dog? All right. So, what's up, dog? Okay. I still don't know what lit means. All right. So he's going to talk to her. Here's what's really cool. They're both Jewish. So Paul has this easy way of talking to her, easy way of communicating with her. And what Paul probably told her is like, hey, you know the Old Testament. You know all the promises of God. You know what God has done. Guess what? They're all fulfilled in Jesus. This sacrificial system that God set up so we would be aware of our sin and aware of our guilt. You know that we always had to have that sacrifice? Well, guess what? God gave us the perfect sacrifice in Jesus. So all of our sins are paid. All of our debts are paid. We have no guilt. We have no condemnation. And God did this because he loves us. Way to pay into mine. That's good. And so Paul shares the good news with her. And it says that her ears were open to hear it. And then it says she was baptized. That was kind of sudden. That was kind of abrupt. Let me explain this to you. This is the pattern in the early church. People would hear the gospel. They would believe who Jesus was, what Jesus did, and the benefits of that. Then they would receive God's good, free gift of grace, and they would immediately get baptized. Now, this is different than how we do it today. Some of you maybe grew up in a church context like I did, where they would do like a really long altar call, where the pastor would be like, we're going to keep playing until someone comes forward. We're going to keep playing. And that pipe organ just gets tired. And it was always an old lady. I'm like, I don't know if she has that much longer, dude. Like, let's wrap this up. And so maybe that's your background. Or like today, it's really popular to kind of like do like a show of hands thing. And that works, and that's effective, and that's a good thing. So we're like, maybe some of us are more accustomed to that. Like you hear something and you raise your hand and say, yeah, I want to respond to Jesus. Back in the early church, they would hear it, and it was just like, quick, how do I get baptized? Where do I get baptized? Where do I go? Can we do it here? Can we do it now? And so that's actually what happens often in the book of Acts, and it happens here with Lydia. She's so moved by God's grace, and she's so blown away by God's promises and his faithfulness that she's like, boom, I believe, I receive, let's get baptized. And so it says she was, go back one. So let's go back to the verse. She gets baptized, and all of her household as well, all of her family members. And then she urged Paul and his crew, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And she prevailed upon us, which means she talked him into it. So now she invites them into her household so she can demonstrate hospitality towards them and warmth towards them and kindness towards them. And here's the crazy thing. It says her household. Well, in the Bible, a lot of times the husband would be talked about before, don't be a distraction, the husband would be talked about before a wife would. And a wife was known by her husband in the Bible a lot of times. Well, it's weird that the husband's not mentioned, which has led people to think, Lydia was probably either a widow or divorced or single. And so she was stepping out and she was leading as a woman. And what's crazy is as Paul and his crew happened upon this group of women, they were looking for a group of men. They were looking for a group of like 10 Jewish men in a circle that they could have like Bible study with or a worship service with. There was no men to be found. There was like a leadership vacuum and void. There was no man to lead this thing. And so these women were like, we got this. And Lydia was like, we got this. And they stepped in, they stepped up, and they led out. And so that's what I want to kind of focus on the back end here as we end today. Guys, thanks for being up here. Everyone give it up, everyone give it up, everyone give it up, everyone give it up. You guys may go, you guys may go. So hopefully that helped you visualize the story. Lydia would go on, as she stepped in and stepped out, Lydia would actually go on to found the church at Philippi. History shows us that she hosted the church in her home. And so from her, other people came to know Jesus. Other people came to hear the gospel and to respond to it. And her household became a place of worship to the one true living God, where people could learn how to follow Jesus and where people felt impelled by the Spirit to live out their faith. And God used Lydia, who was this woman who stepped into a context where normally men were supposed to lead, and in a Roman culture where men dominated, she stepped in, stepped up, and she led out. And God used her to help build the church. And so here's where I want to go with this, okay? Here's where I want to drive home with you guys. So 3 weeks ago, I taught a sermon where I was just like, hey, girls, hold on one sec. Ding, 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 ding. Fellas, this one's for you. I'm going to point the sermon square at you guys. I want you guys to hear this. Today, and then I told girls, scoot to the edge of your seat, because I'm going to talk to these boys about who God's called them to be, the men that they're created and called to be. Not conquerors, but caregivers. And I talked about this 3 weeks ago. Well, this week, I want to do the opposite. And I want to talk mostly to the young ladies here. I want to talk to the young women here. And fellas, you scoot to the edge of your seat, because when we talk about, that was weird, because when we talk, I feel like a flight attendant. Exits on the left and right. As we talk about the kind of woman God created you to be and what God has called you to do as a woman, fellas, this is the kind of woman you need to be looking for. Like, you need to be looking for that kind of girl who's leading out and stepping up to what God's called her to do. So here's what I want you guys to write down. Remember, it's so simple. Don't get it tattooed because I don't want to get in trouble, but whatever way you have to remember it, lead like Lydia. That's what I want you to remember. Lead like Lydia. That's called alliteration. It makes it easy, kids. Lead like Lydia. Step up and step into that opportunity. And so I want to give you some context for it, okay? I want to visualize this for you. So in your schools, maybe there's a leadership vacuum and void. Maybe at your school you're like, I'm one of like 2 Christians maybe. Or maybe in your friend group, you're like, well, some of my friends go to church, but I'm going to be real with you. They don't really act like it. And so maybe there's a leadership vacuum and void there. Well, as a woman created by God, called by Jesus, and empowered by the Spirit, you need to step in, step up, and lead out where there's a vacuum and a void there. You don't need to just be passive and just be like, well, I'm a girl. That's a boy's job. No, you see with Lydia, she steps up and she leads. And here's the thing. If you do this in your school, maybe, because of this leadership vacuum and void, maybe you're the only Jesus that some of your friends will ever see. Maybe you're the only Jesus. Maybe you're the only person that people can look at and be like, man, there's something different there. There's something profound there. I want to be more like that. So lead out in your school. Lead like Lydia. Some of you, maybe this is applicable for your family, all right? Maybe there's a leadership vacuum or void in your family. Maybe your siblings are not believers. And what an opportunity for you as a young lady to step up and say, hey, you know what? I'm gonna step in and step up and I'm gonna lead out. I'm gonna be a good example to my siblings. When they look to me, they should see a good example of what a Jesus follower looks like. I should be a peacemaker in my family. And maybe for some of you, your parents aren't believers. Maybe your parents aren't Jesus followers. And maybe you have a profound opportunity to impact your parents. In fact, I know that's some of your guys' stories. And they tell us in seminary all the time, Family is your first ministry. And I'm like, well, my family can't fire me for not doing my job, but I see the point, And perhaps family is your first ministry, your first line of defense. And so some of you, there's a leadership vacuum and void with your parents, and God has called you. You've been given this incredible opportunity to step into this leadership position as a young lady and say, you know what? That's going to change with me. And I'm going to lead out. And as you do that, maybe you're the only Jesus that your family sees. Maybe your parents, maybe your siblings, maybe your extended family. Maybe you're the only Jesus that they see. And maybe there's something infectious about that, something that's inspiring about that. When they look at you and they go, wow, there's something different there. Some of you need to lead out and just lead like a Lydia in your family. Some of you need to step out and lead in church. And let me tell you this, and we don't talk about this in church a lot. There is a long, rich history of women leading amongst God's people. You go all the way back to Exodus. There's this woman named Miriam. I'll give you the fast version. There's this woman named Miriam, and she helped lead songs on the other side of slavery, and she helped lead the people in praise to God. Later on, there was this woman named Deborah, and there was no judge to rule the land, and Deborah's like, I got this, and that's how she said it too, I got this. And Deborah stepped up into this position. Later on, there was this woman named Ruth who came from this broken, horrible, horrific family situation. She's like, no, I'm going to lead my family. I'm going to take care of my family. Later on in the Old Testament, there's this woman named Esther, and her people are going to experience a genocide, and they're going to be murdered. And she steps up and is brave, and she's bold, and she's confident, and she believes in the Lord. And she's like, no, I'm going to help save my people, and she does. And the Lord works through her in that. Then in the New Testament, you have this young woman named Mary, and God appears to her and says, hey, you're going to give birth to Jesus. And he's going to be Emmanuel, God with us, God in the flesh. And so God entrusted this woman with that, and what a great responsibility. And then even later on in Jesus' ministry, there's this other woman named Mary, who's the sister of Lazarus, and she comes and she helps support Jesus' ministry. She funds some of Jesus' ministry, and she helps house the disciples. Then we come to the story of Lydia, and she's in this place where there's no leadership, none at all, and she steps in and she leads out. And then later on in the book of Acts, there's another woman named Priscilla who welcomes people into her house and helps build the church there. Later on, there's this woman named Phoebe who helps serve the church and take care of the sick there and feed people there. Later on, there's this other woman in the church, and she goes on to be an apostle in the church, a leader in the church. Her name's Junia. And then even in the early church, this is one of my favorite stories. My wife's heard me tell this story before. Women were responsible for the outreach and care of orphans in the early church. Because in Roman society, if you didn't want your baby, they would actually just leave it outside in the cold. They're like, I don't want my baby, or there's something wrong with my baby, I'm going to leave it outside. And women in the early church would come around and they would say, excuse me, and they would take and pick up these babies and be like, you must have lost your mind, and bring them back to the church and care for them. And so women have always led out in the church. And I would say part of the foundation of the church has been built on the faithfulness of faithful women, on the love and the labor of faithful women who led out. And you know what's different today? Nothing. The church still needs women to step in and lead. And we have a lot of women that help lead here in different ministries and who serve here in ministry. And every female group leader, would you mind raising your hand for a second? Every female group leader, would you mind? We have leaders in this room. Amazing, selfless leaders in this room. Yeah, give it up for them. And young ladies, you can look at them as a good godly example and be like, yeah, I want to be like them. I want to be like them. I see Jesus in them. I see leadership in them. You need to step out and step in and lead out with that. But here's the last thing I kind of want to talk to you about. I want you, young ladies in the room, and I tried to craft the sermon as, okay, what would I say to my future daughter if I have a daughter? I can't tell you your name so you don't steal it, so we just call her little baby J, okay? I made the mistake of telling someone a child name I liked one time, and then they took it. So, right, that's cold. And so, or I can give you a terrible name. We're going to call her Football Cleat, okay? Take that, Football Cleat. Yeah, that's what we're going to name her. And so I want this sermon to be like what I would tell my daughter. And here's the thing. I want you to lead in your future relationships. As young women, I want you to be leaders in your relationship. Now, here's the deal. A lot of times, and this is what I grew up with a lot, it was like, girls, just wait and be patient for the male leader that God will bring into your life. A good, strong, godly leader, that's a man. Here's what I would say to that. Yes. Wait for that good, godly leader that's a guy. And fellas, you want to be that good, godly leader. You want to be that guy that can lead well. But here's the deal. Here's what I don't like about that. Sometimes the language you use for that is like, wait, chill, be patient, be passive. And then the stats, like statistically and societally, people are staying single longer. So you hit your early 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s, mid-30s, late 30s. And sometimes people are still like, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for this person. I'm still waiting for leadership. And then you get so far in your life and it's like you've just been waiting, like your life is on pause or something like that. No, that is not what Jesus has called you to. That's not how God created you. That's not what Jesus is leading you to. And that's not how the Holy Spirit is empowering you. No, you need to lead yourself. That's the thing. You need to lead yourself. So with all the things we've talked about, you need to step up. So be a leader now in your school. Be a leader now in your family and be Jesus to those people. Be a leader now in your church. Help out in leading groups. Help out in outreach ministry. Help out in whatever needs to be done. And start developing healthy patterns and habits to where you are seeking the Lord. You are walking with the Lord. You're studying the Word. You have an active prayer life. You're showing people the grace and kindness of God. Do that now. Now, girls, don't listen. Hey, fellas. What I just described, that's what you're looking for, okay? That's exactly what you're looking for. Girl that's a leader in her school, that's hot, okay? Like, look for that. Girl that's a leader, stepping out and being Jesus to her family, that's hot, okay? Girl that's serving in the church, that's hot, okay? I do declare, that's what you want, okay? Girls, you can listen again. So fellas, just keep that in mind. That's what you need to be looking for. And so start leading yourself. And then here's the hope, okay? Here's what I hope for you guys. You guys become strong leaders. You become strong women doing what Jesus has called you to do. And then someday you look over and you find a guy who comes along who also is a good, strong leader for Jesus in his school and in his family and in his church. And then you two are going to be a strong couple. And you guys are going to be able to lead together and you're going to be able to support one another and build one another up in love. And I know, I mean, even as a pastor, there's ways in which, as a man, I feel like I lead our family. And then there's other ways, I'm going to be just 100, where I feel like my wife leads me in some ways that's super helpful. Where she's like, hey, Matt, it's a 40-hour work week, not an 80-hour work week. Or like, you know, more than 4 hours of sleep is great, you know? And so like there's ways where my wife is able to provide leadership and ways in which I'm able to provide leadership. And I feel like we can complement each other well in that. And I mean, of course, it's 90 me, 10 her. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Don't hurt me. Just kidding. But there's this like mutuality and we can help and support one another. So young ladies in the room, that's what I want for you guys. That was what I would want to tell my daughter, football cleat Johnston, someday. That's her name. That's what I want you to know. And so I want to end tonight by just encouraging you in this. A lot of the language, and especially for like when I was growing up, in youth group a lot, they would have these like girl talks and stuff. And I felt like the language was always like, girls, sit around and wait, and your daddy will provide you, your king, you know, your daughter the king, and your king will provide you a prince someday. And in the meantime, just wait and do your devotionals. And I'm like, that's good. Like, that's all good. Wait. Be patient. Amen. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Yes, your heavenly Father loves you. You are a daughter of the King. You have so much value and worth. But what I don't love about that, and I'm putting like, you know, little football cleat Johnston, my daughter, into this situation. What I would want to tell my daughter is, well, that's predicated on being passive. So basically, you just have to kind of like sit around and like, I'll be like, no, lead out now. And so many women's events when I was a kid for young ladies was like, wait, quiet, patient, where I'm like, they should do one with like, you some bad women, okay? Like, you need to know that. You are strong. Like, that's what I would want my daughter to hear. I think we're taping this. I'm going to look at the camera. You need to hear that. You are strong, okay? Jesus has empowered you. God has created you in his image. Jesus has redeemed you, and the Holy Spirit is empowering you. So lead out. Be bold. Be confident. Be courageous. And do what the Lord has called you to do. And wherever you find yourself, where there's a leadership void or vacuum, step in, step up, and lead out. And do that good thing that Jesus is calling you to do. And be Jesus in every friendship you have, every relationship you have, every context you find yourself, every school, every job, everything. Do what God has called you to do and lead like Lydia. Let's pray.